Okay, we are live. Welcome everyone to the Wildcast. I am thrilled to begin the third of our last of this three-part series, Science and Religion, Friends or Foes. I am joined this afternoon by an esteemed guest, Dr. Herman Presby, also is Rabbi Dr. Herman Presby, but I will be referring to him as Dr. Herman Presby because that's the context of what we're discussing. He is a world-renowned scientist who specializes in photonics. And Dr. Presby received his PhD from the Belfer Graduate School of Science, was a research scientist at Columbia University and assistant professor of physics at the Belfer Graduate School of Science. Dr. Presby was a distinguished member of staff at Bell Laboratories, where he was manager of the Photonics Applications Research and Development Group and a research architect at TerraBeam Corporation, publishing more than 180 papers and one book and holding in excess of 200 U.S. and foreign patents, which is incredibly impressive. He is also a fellow of the Optical Society of America. And Rabbi Dr. Herman Presby is a teacher of Torah and of Judaism, a regular lecturer on this topic of Torah and science at Gateways, another wonderful institution. And he is most notably the grandfather of Nathaniel Schlackman. Nathaniel and Carly are very active MGE couple who we have the zechut, the great honor of hosting every Shabbos at MGE in all of our classes. You must have a lot of nachas from them, Dr. Presby. Thank you for joining and welcome.
My absolute pleasure. And thanks to Nathaniel and Carly for recommending this, and great thanks to you for having me on.
Well, it is actually Nathaniel. It's an honor and a pleasure, Doctor. And it was actually Nathaniel and Carly's idea. We were having Shabbat lunch, and they said, you really should interview my grandfather about his new book, The ABCs of Science, of Torah and Science. And he's a real authority on the issues of Torah and science. And then that got me thinking, why don't we open it up? And 2 weeks ago, I interviewed Rabbi Dr. Natan Slifkin, whose area is zoology. And last week, Dr. Gerald Schroeder, who's also a physicist. And it's just been an incredible exploration of this important topic for me personally and for many of our students at the Manhattan Jewish Experience. So, Rabbi, Doctor, before we get into some of the apparent contradictions between Torah and science, tell us what drew you to the world of science and what value as a religious Jew and as a rabbi that you see in studying science.
Okay, great. That's a great question, Rabbi Wildes. And I think there's a great answer. And for me, that answer really comes from the Rambam. The Rambam in his Mishnah Torah asks a very interesting question. We know that there is a mitzvah, there is a command of Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem, of love of God and fear of God. Fear here really meaning being in awe of God and recognizing God's presence in the world. And the Rambam asks, how does one come to this? How can one fulfill those mitzvos? They seem like very esoteric, very deep meaning mitzvos of love and of awe. How is it fulfilled? And the Rambam in his Mishnah Torah says that by studying the wonders of God's creation, an individual will arrive at an attainment of Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem. And the quote from his work is very complete, and he tells us that by reflecting on the wonders of the universe, one will recognize the infinite wisdom of the Creator, and this leads one to an attachment and to a real like to get closer to this great being that's responsible for the existence of the universe. So my approach is one of a very deep feeling of love of God and awe of God. And the more science that I do, the more science that I am involved in, the more that I feel God's presence in the world and the more that I see it. And
Beautiful.
in fact, the book that I wrote is one to transmit that feeling, through seeing God in many areas in the world.
That's it, and I think you did very successfully communicate that sentiment in the book. As a scientist, Albert Einstein has this great quote. I actually used it in advertising our discussion today. He said that science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind.
Huh.
Do you agree with that statement?
Well, I agree with a lot of things that Einstein has done. Einstein was absolutely amazing. He really changed the world with his God-given insight in several areas, and just amazing. But accepting lots of the things that Einstein has done, like relativity, special and general relativity, like studies in gravity and what have you, does not mean that we accept everything that Einstein has said. So one has to really understand this statement. And I would say that if science includes a ruchnius component, namely a spiritual component, then science is truly lame without it. And if that component comes from religion, then hey, how much more valuable science would be if it recognizes that component. And the same in the other direction. In other words, that if religion without science, in other words, if one does not use science, as we just discussed from the Rambam, in seeing God's presence in the world and recognizing that presence, then I feel that one is missing something in one's religious life. And so I would agree with that statement. Again, conditional on science accepting ruchnius, accepting spirituality, and on us seeing God's presence as a statement of true belief in religion itself.
Wow. Now, in your book, Rabbi Doctor, The ABCs of Torah and Science, so you argue, like many do, that the complexity of the universe implies a deliberate and intelligent designer. So how do you respond to all those scientists who explain that we don't need God to explain all of this? We have evolution, we have random mutation, natural selection, all of this complexity. It can be explained as happening all on its own. What's your response to that?
My response is that is wishful thinking. And I approach evolution, I approach this whole topic from a science perspective. And my own view on it is that there truly is no solid scientific evidence for evolution. Mutations and are items that are always found to be deleterious. They're harmful. In fact, if one looks for evidence of mutations, one only has to look at what's been going on for the equivalent of billions of years of mutations that have been induced in fruit flies. Lots of universities, in fact, most universities have fruit fly studies. They're easy to keep and what have you, and easy to induce mutations. And they've been mutated for the equivalent of billions of years. And you know what's come out of it? Out of all of those studies, the only thing that one has found has been sick fruit flies. One has found components of their bodies, strangely formed and what have you. There has never been found a positive mutation coming out of all of these irradiations of these poor fruit flies. So the evidence just is not there that mutations can bring about all of these amazing items that we see in the world itself. The clincher for me is something that is within us ourselves. There's a verse in the book of Eov, of Job, and Job said, "Mibisari echse Elokim," Mibisari, from my own flesh, I see God. And I think that is so meaningful in this context. If you look at every cell in our body, what does every cell have? Every cell has a nucleus. And what's inside that nucleus? Inside that nucleus are all of the instructions that give rise to the individual, that give rise to every living creature. And those instructions are contained in an amazing molecule called DNA.
Mhm.
That DNA molecule is information rich. It contains several billion codes of information, and it's responsible for life itself and the instructions that make life what it is. Where did that molecule come from? How did that molecule come about from an evolutionary perspective? That's a question that has science dumbfounded. In fact, if you look at the response to the evolution of life here and its complexity, the Nobel Prize winner, Dr. Crick himself, who got the Nobel Prize for
Right.
DNA,
Yeah, Francis
said
Crick.
that you know what? It's absolutely impossible for life to have started here and for this complexity to have come about through this process of evolution. Well, how did it come about? And you know what Dr. Crick says? It came through something that he calls panspermia, which means outer space, that we got all of this here through aliens. They brought it here to Earth. That sort of avoids the whole issue, because what would you ask Dr. Crick? Where did the aliens get it from? And what would the answer be? Other aliens. And, it's that famous statement of aliens all the way down. So that's no answer, but it does recognize the real impossibility of these items coming about, a information rich structure, our DNA coming through a process of evolution. There is absolutely no way that something like that can come through random mutations. And again, those mutations are generally deleterious and are harmful, and we've never seen any beneficial result from them. So, from just a science perspective, there's a lot that's missing in this belief in everything coming about through random mutations.
So why is it? Thank you so much. Why is it so widely accepted, though?
Yeah.
Even within, the other two speakers with whom I discussed do believe,
Yes.
clearly believe in God and in Torah and all
Yes.
that, but believe that God used
Yes.
evolution in order to develop,
Yes.
the complexity we see today. Why is it so?
Yes.
If there's no positive evidence that mutations can create such beauty and such positivity, because you're saying that mutations really, are deleterious. They create deleterious results, not
Correct.
positive ones generally. Then how is it so widely believed that evolution is the best explanation?
Right. Let me tell you a story that happened with me. As you mentioned in the introduction, my field is photonics.
Hmm.
Photonics means light, and my specialty.
And by the way, Doctor, just if I ever look down, it's because I'm typing notes because I want to remember
Oh, that's
everything you say.
fine.
Okay,
That's
go.
fine.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
great. Uh, so photonics is
Hmm.
everything dealing with light, and my own subspecialty within light is something called fiber optics, optical
Hmm.
fibers that I'm sure you have and your listeners have heard of. Right, it's the technology with which communication now takes place around the world. Uh, and it's an area where, as you mentioned, I have many patents. One of the prime series of patents that I have is an invention within fiber optics of a way of getting light into the fiber. Uh, Let me digress a little bit
Hmm.
technically. I think it will be helpful, and that is a fiber is just picture a hair. A fiber is just about the size of a human hair, and picture your hair being made out of glass, and now stretch that for 100, for 1,000, for thousands of miles. That's an optical fiber. How do you get light into that fiber? Well, that was a showstopper very early in the development of fiber optics, and it became a goal of many countries that were working on it. After something like 20 years or so and yearly conferences, the Japanese were happy to announce that they were able to get something like 40% of the light from a little laser into the fiber. And that's not quite good enough because you're throwing away 60% of your energy. We tackled the problem, and within 2 weeks, we were able to get 100% of the light into an optical fiber. It made quite a splash, and we kept it a secret for 2 years till we got this into product. And that's another separate story that we can go into. But how was it done? And the way it was done was with a very unique lens that was formed on the end of the optical fiber itself. It was a hyperbolic shape which was able to collect all of the light from a laser into the fiber. So I was interested in seeing, hey, does something like this exist in nature? And sure enough, I found there's something called a brittle starfish. I'm not sure if that's very familiar, but starfish are familiar, right? It's a creature
Sure.
that has 5 appendages. It looks like a star, lives and crawls around on the bottom of the ocean. It turns out that those appendages are filled with eyes, amazing eyes. And those eyes actually have perfect vision. And what do those eyes consist of? Well, it turns out that the brittle starfish is made out of calcite, which is a material that is very uh, deleterious for light. It distorts light and what have you. So no one ever knew how one could make a perfect lens out of this material. It turns out that the starfish did, and that perfect lens is of the shape of the lens that we had invented for an optical fiber. So I had an interest in the starfish and their lenses, and the group that discovered this lens on the starfish, it turned out, was at Bell Laboratories. And in fact, the head of that group had an office directly below mine. I went down to visit that individual, and I said, "Hey, this is a great piece of work." And the researcher handed me a starfish that I was happy to hold, and I said, "Tell me, how did this starfish do it? How was it able to make such a perfect lens out of this calcite material?" And I was asked, "Well, didn't you read my whole paper?" I said, "Of course I did." And she said that it's in the last paragraph. And I said, "Oh, the paragraph that reads that the starfish, through the process of evolution, developed this amazing, amazing lens?" I said, "So it was evolution that did it?" She said, "Yes, it was evolution." I said, "Could you spell out the steps in that evolutionary process that made this lens?" She said, "No, I can't. I can't." I said, "Well, you have 5 other co-authors. Do you think they can do it?" She said, "No, don't waste your time asking them. They don't know either." I said, "So how can you, as a noted researcher, claim that it was a process that you can't explain, that it just happened through something you call evolution, and you're not able to describe that process?" So she said, "What's the option? What's the option? What other explanation is there for this?" And I said, "Well, I certainly have another explanation." And she said, "Yes, but we don't believe in that." This is the attitude, Rabbi Wildes. And that attitude is, what's the option? That option is recognizing the infinite great wisdom of the creator of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and accepting his presence and his involvement in the world. And that is not an option for scientists. Scientists want to explain everything in a natural, materialistic way, and evolution is an answer to that. The option is just not in their way of thinking. And I
Hmm.
think this really brings home the whole uh, the whole item with regards to a such a deep acceptance of evolution, even though the evidence for it just isn't there. And what the answer always is, what's the option? And we can't accept that option.
And so, how would you then? This is very helpful, and the starfish is a really good demonstration of, I guess, the scientific world's inability to just say
Yeah,
we don't know, we can't explain it, we have to resort not to something we can't explain, but something else maybe we can't explain, which is God. But um, my question is, I mean, so you don't believe, therefore, that God used evolution? In other
I,
words, so
I
that yeah.
yeah. Now my feeling is, why push on God a a way, a method which doesn't make scientific sense, and say that he used this technique? If it was something which made scientific sense, then we could say, and I'd be the first to agree that, hey, that here's a valid way that God did it. In other words, very similar to Big Bang cosmology. In other words, how do we see the origin of the universe? How did this come about? And Big Bang cosmology has a lot going for it. But again, we can discuss that in more detail, if we have time and you would like. So one could say, you know what? God used this technique of Big Bang cosmology to get the universe going. And that seems to be, as far as it looks now, a valid scientific theory. But to take a scientific theory that does not look valid and to say God used that is embarrassing. Why put God in that position to use something that does not make scientific sense?
And there's just no, I say I'm not a scientist, so I can't speak intelligently to this, but there's
Well,
no, in your opinion, positive scientific evidence that through, I heard this when I was younger, that
yes.
a giraffe got its long neck because it had to keep stretching in order to
Ah,
eventually get the leaves off the tree. It's a herbivore,
yes.
it eats
That
from leaves. And then over all of these periods of generations, the neck just
yes.
keeps getting longer and longer to survive. Survival
That
of the fittest.
Rabbi, well, that is not evolution. That is something
Okay.
called adaptation. And
Mm-hmm.
and that is creatures, living creatures adapting to their environment. And that is something that's indisputable. Adaptation is something that we see, all over the place. And that's very real. And that is something that is responsible for what one might call microevolution.
Mm-hmm.
Microevolution is certainly correct. Microevolution are changes within a species. In other words, there's all forms of dogs, but they're still dogs. There's all forms of creatures, but they're still that very same creature. You do not see a fruit fly, as we mentioned before, turning into a butterfly. In other words, they remain fruit flies. So adaptation is the ability of a species within the species to turn into various variations within that species. There are all sorts of dogs. There are all sorts of horses. There are all sorts of various creatures within the same family. But going from that, which is what Darwin did, and said, well, you can now go with enough changes and make that creature into an entirely different species, is not microevolution, but that is macroevolution, for which there is no evidence. In fact, the evidence that Darwin wanted to bring for this were something called the Darwin's finches, these birds that lived on these islands, and their beaks were different sizes dependent on the food supply there. That was adapting. That was adaptation. That was not evolution. So microevolution, again, changes within a species certainly exists. In fact, we've lost you, Rabbi Wildes. Are
Hold
we?
on. No, no,
Just,
I've been
oh,
listening. I
okay.
think
If you're
everyone,
still being
I think
heard,
everyone
okay,
else has been able to hear you. Can you hear me? Okay.
okay, fine. I can hear you, not see you. So,
Okay.
in fact,
So what you're saying, just so I can understand, so adaptation, the idea that a creature within a species can adapt to one's environment,
Correct.
microevolution. But what you're referring to when you talk about that you don't see any positive evidence to evolution, and you're talking about macroevolution, okay?
Correct.
And
Correct.
macroevolution is referring to the idea of random mutation of, let's say, natural select. I always
And
thought that that
natural
was
selection.
right,
Right.
and that
Turning one species into another.
right,
That has not been seen.
right.
In fact,
But it's so,
micro.
but it's so believed in your opinion simply because
Yes,
there's no better explanation.
there is a better explanation, but one that is not accepted by the scientific world as a whole.
Right.
That better explanation is right in our hands, and that better explanation is given by Hakadosh Baruch Hu in the Torah, and is given for centuries and centuries in our Torah Shebaal Peh. That better explanation is God's presence, God's existence, and God's control of the world and God's involvement in the world.
I hear you. I hear you. And all right, let's get back here then. So that's basically, in your opinion, what you think other physicists or scientists who are agnostics or atheists are missing or
Well,
understanding differently.
oh, absolutely. It's very interesting. I don't know if you've heard, there was a rabbi, Eliyahu Meir Block. He was the founder of the Telza Yeshiva in Cleveland.
Hmm.
And he had a very interesting insight based on a verse in Tehillim, a verse in Psalms. That verse says the following. It's in our prayers. Ma gadlu
Hmm.
ma'asecha Hashem. How wonderful are your deeds, God. Ma'od amku machshavosecha. How profound are your thoughts. The next verse says, Ish bar lo yeda, a fool will not understand it. Ukesil lo yavenasos, nor will an ignorant individual comprehend this. Rabbi Block said that even more amazing than God's deeds in nature and God's workings in the universe is the second part of this, which is that someone can see it and still not see God's presence in it. In other words, that man can observe, can behold the magnificence of God's handiwork and yet deny his existence. That is even more amazing than God's handiwork. In other words, that it just is so clear that God's hand is there, and yet one struggles to provide just so excuses and stories as to how these items came about when the answer is very, very clear.
And so let's shift a little. What then is? I mean, how old do you believe the world actually is then?
Age of the universe, that's a big story. If someone would ask me, Dr. Presby, what's the age of the universe? I would say it's 5,782 years plus 6 God days of creation. What are
Hmm.
those? What are those 6 God days of creation? We have absolutely no idea. And what do I mean by that? Could they be 6 normal days? Yes, they can. Can they be millions or billions of years? Yes, they can. We don't know. And I think this is a very fundamental point that I'd like to make. And that is something that the Ramban Nachmanides makes in his introduction to his commentary to the Torah. And let me quote from the Ramban because it is so very important.
Hmm.
Okay, if I use the Hebrew and translate, or you
Please,
just like the
please,
English?
please. No. Please go for it.
Okay, good. So let me read from the Ramban. He says the following: Maaseh Bereshis. And I'll translate as I go. Maaseh Bereshis, the process of creation, Sod Amok, is a profound mystery. Eino muvan min hamikros, which cannot be understood from the verses. V'lo yivada al burav, and it cannot be clearly known. Ela mipi hakabbalah, only from a tradition. Ad Moshe Rabbeinu mipi hagvura, that traces back to Moshe Rabbeinu, who received it from the mouth of the Almighty. The Yodav Chayavin Lahaster Oso, and those who know it are obligated to conceal it. This is the Ramban. What's the Ramban telling us? We don't know a word in the chapter of creation. And so taking it literally and saying, oh, here's what it says, is just not correct. We just don't know. It is something that is called Maaseh Bereshis, the works of creation, and it's a mystery. It's a profound mystery, and it's that mystery that we struggle with, and we are not privileged to fully understand. Can we get a glimpse of some items? Yes, but we just don't know if those items are correct or not. And that applies to the age of the universe. What is it? And how can it be the 5782 and 7 real days as we know them? We don't know. We don't know. And how could it be billions of years? Again, we don't know. There is another possibility, and I should mention that it was the possibility that I received from my mentor, a Rav Pessin Zatzal, a absolute brilliant Torah scholar. He was a Rav in Muncie, and Rav Pessin said that the following is probably the most satisfactory resolution of this, and that's the following. He held that creation took place in a spiritual state, that the world was created spiritually. Spiritual items are what's described in the Torah. And the world only became physical with the chait, with the transgression, with the sin of Adam. That sin transformed the world from its ruchnius, from its spiritual state, into a physical state. And Rav Pessin asks, what is the transformation equation for one day? In other words, the one day that's mentioned in the chapter of creation was truly one day, but one spiritual day. When that got converted into physical days, how many physical days go into one spiritual day? And that is a possibility that we're seeing in terms of the age of the universe. Again, the bottom line is we do not know.
And just going back to what your teacher of Pessin suggested, that creation takes place in a spiritual state and then only becomes physically transformed into a physical
Yes.
world as we know it when Adam sinned. So then when the Torah is describing day 1, day
Yes.
2, day 3, day 4, according to Rav Pessin, those all happened after. That's describing what happened after Adam sinned.
No. Those are describing a spiritual state. In other words, we don't know.
Even though it's describing trees and plants.
Correct. Yeah, there are spiritual trees. There's a spiritual sun. There's spiritual vegetation. And they all got transformed into the physical state that we now see with the chait of Adam. Correct.
Mm-hmm. But as far as but as far as you're concerned, we don't really know. In other words, it could have been 24-hour days. You're saying
Correct.
It could have been 24 hours a days. You're not, because you're not impressed at all with evolution, macro evolution. I learned
Okay.
that. You, in other words, you don't see the need to fit, those 6 days plus Shabbat into, billions of years.
Correct.
Because that's just based on the evolutionary sort of dating of the universe. But what would you say to, we do have sediment, in certain lakes, and we have rings on certain trees
Absolutely.
that make the world older than 5,782.
Sure.
I mean,
yes.
And we have fossils, we have dinosaur fossils.
Sure. And the Talmud addresses itself to that in 2 places. And the Talmud tells us that the world was created in a finished state. How old was Adam? How old was Adam when he was created?
He was created as an adult.
Absolutely. He was created as an adult. How many rings were there in those trees that were created? How many? And again, where was that light that was created from the distant galaxies when they were created? They were on the way here to planet Earth. In other words, that the universe was created fully formed and fully completed. And that is what we're observing. We're observing a universe that looks old, but was created in that state.
And is there any Torah on that? Meaning, if that would be such a, I would imagine that would invite so much commentary and discussion amongst our sages, because
Well,
it would seem to go against what we would all think the way things would, that for Hashem to purposely create something that looks much older than in actual.
Well, again, that is the statement that we find in the Talmud itself. It appears in two places in the Talmud that Kol Habriya, that all of creation, the Komasan, were created in their full, final, finished state. So it's a statement that the Talmud brings, and it is one that we accept. Rabbi Wild, I think I lost you. Am I being heard? Scott, are you there? I see the live statement here and time ticking away live, but again, I don't know if I'm with you or not.